Okay, let's get going. First, the story of this class. I work primarily in the field of early modern French legal literature, so 17th, 18th century, meaning I read and write about the things that lawyers and judges read and wrote about several hundred years ago. It would seem a far cry from a course on taste. However, these lawyers and judges were deeply, deeply concerned with matters of taste. Why is that? Because beyond the important issue of convincing the judges of their case, there was a public in attendance at the courthouse as well. Their pleadings, meaning the lawyers' pleadings, so their speeches, had to cater to the taste of the judges as well as to the taste of the general public. This was a very tricky thing to do. Every lawyer had to be Johnny Cochran. But the social environment actually made matters even worse. The judges themselves were typically members of the nobility or on their way there. They were generally wealthy and very educated, while the general public in the courthouse were typically from the lower classes. They came there to enjoy the free heats and hear the latest gossip. They could be very loud and unruly, and in the 17th century especially, they were largely illiterate. And yet the lawyer had to make his speech pleasing and informative to them as well as their judges. In fact, lawyers, along with priests, were often the only sources of education for the lower classes, and this role was taken very seriously by the lawyers as well as the judges. They felt it was their moral duty to influence the public in the room toward justice. And in fact, in earlier centuries, there's evidence that they may have even been a little bit fearful of the public attendance turning against the lawyers or judges, and therefore it was doubly essential to captivate the attention of the public and channel it in a peaceful direction. Thus, the lawyers of the 17th century had to tailor their speeches to the taste of the judges, who were thought to be governed by reason or their rational capacities, as well as the taste of the general spectators, who were thought to be governed by their feelings or sentiments. The lawyers' pleadings had to be rational for the judges, yet pleasant for the spectators. They had to be informative, yet interesting. They could not afford to be dry, nor could they risk stirring up too much emotion in the gallery. Essentially, they had to blend the bad taste of the people with the good taste of the judges. But why was the taste of the people necessarily bad and that of the judges necessarily good? In 17th century France, society was extremely hierarchical. There was no such thing as social mobility, and anyone who attempted to rise from lower origins into which they were born to ascend the higher origins through mercantilism, through banking, they were endlessly mocked for their bad taste. Some of the 17th century's greatest plays portray this new social phenomenon. You can think of Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, or in English, The Would-Be Noble. Here we see the frontispiece from the 1688 edition of Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme by Molière. It's the story of a would-be gentleman, Monsieur Jourdain, who's a wealthy tradesman, and it's a gentle satire on the fact that he's trying to rise above his own station by patronizing the fashionable tailors and hiring tutors in music, dancing, fencing, philosophy, in order to acquire the polish of the noble gentleman, which is something that in late 17th century was just never going to happen. I'll read an excerpt in English of a couple of the masters that Monsieur Jourdain has hired to give him this gentlemanly polish. It's the music master and the dancing master. The music master. "We've found here such a man as we both need. This is a nice source of income for us. This Monsieur Jourdain, with the visions of nobility and gallantry that he has gotten into his head, you and I should hope that everyone resembled him." Dancing master. "Not entirely. I could wish that he understood better the things that we give him." Music master. It's true that he understands them poorly, but he pays well, and that's what our art needs now more than anything else. Dancing master. As for me, I admit I feed a little on glory. Applause touches me, and I hold that, in all the fine arts, it is painful to produce for dolts, to endure the barbarous opinions of a fool about my choreography. It is a pleasure, don't tell me otherwise, to work for people who can appreciate the fine points of an art, who know how to give a sweet reception to the beauties of a work, and, by pleasurable approbations, gratify us for our labor. Yes, the most agreeable recompense we can receive for the things we do is to see them recognized and flattered by an applause that honors us. There is nothing, in my opinion, that pays us better for all our fatigue, and it is an exquisite delight to receive the praises of the well-informed. Music master. I agree, and I enjoy them as you do. There is surely nothing more agreeable than the applause you speak of, but that incense does not provide a living. Pure praises do not provide a comfortable existence. It is necessary to add something solid, and the best way to praise is to praise with cash in hand. He's a man, it's true, whose insight is very slight, who talks nonsense about everything and applauds only for the wrong reasons. But his money makes up for his judgments. He has discernment in his purse. His praises are in cash, and this ignorant bourgeois is worth more to us, as you see, than the educated nobleman who introduced us here. Nobility was a matter of birth, and blood could not lie. As an aside, if we think of today's culture, I think of new money being kind of gaudy and tasteless compared with the old money, but we'll get back to that later. So you have these very fixed concepts of high-born and low-born, and they were virtually set in stone. And they had the corollary in the religious idea of the soul as well. The medieval vision of the soul, and this didn't change really until the Enlightenment, was a three-part pyramid. There was at the top reason, so that was kind of the state. The judges, they occupied reason. They were the most intelligent, but they were the ones who controlled their minds through reason. And then you have the middle level, which was imagination, and imagination then was above passions, and the passions is what we would say today as feelings. So the judges were at the top with reason, and the people, or the peasants, or just the commoners, were at the bottom with passions. And that meant that they let themselves be governed by their passions, that they were emotional. They were kind of a dangerous set of people because it was impossible to reason with them, because they were their souls, they were the disordered part of the soul of the state. So these concepts of highborn and lowborn were pretty much set in stone. The bloodlines of the families were tracked in minute detail, and for very good reason. The nobles had many official privileges, including exemption from many taxes. So they were not required to pay taxes, but we must also keep in mind that the nobles were not permitted to have gainful employment either. If you were born a noble, you could not decide to become a shoemaker or a dressmaker or anything like that. You could not have a job. If you did take on a job outside of a judgeship, perhaps, you would forfeit your nobility, meaning you would forfeit your name, you'd forfeit your land, your financial privileges, and your entire social network. The same was true if you married outside of your social class, kind of Lady in the Tramp style. You would basically be unnamed, and you'd pretty much vanish. The idea behind this is that the nobility helped the king establish his kingdom, and that the sole purpose of the nobility was the protection and glory of the kingdom. They were knights and magistrates. They were not tailors or shoemakers, who arguably would define France today. The nobility were thought to protect and expand the French borders, while the best a non-noble could do would be to live in faithful obedience according to his or her birth. Thus, taste in the broad sense of good or bad taste was largely a matter of inheritance in the 17th century.